bows or crossbows for your early range progression? Let's find out. Following up from my last video where I tested endgame crossbow builds, I concluded that Hydrix Bichromia bolts perform the best out of all the Bichromia bolt options, but it still doesn't come close to modern endgame bow builds. A lot of you pointed out that I should have compared tier 90 crossbows directly against tier 90 bows instead. That was super unrealistic because I had endgame gear in other categories, so in this video, I'd rather compare them from a very early game point of view. The one thing that never changes with ranged is the absurd amount of ammo being consumed. Assuming roughly 350 ammo consumed per hour based on my previous video, the cost difference already becomes noticeable. If we buy 350 full arrows, they're only around 1.2k each, but if we buy 350 Hydrix Bichromia bolts, those are already more expensive. Right away, crossbow builds are already at a severe disadvantage in terms of upkeep cost alone. Okay, so what if we make ammo ourselves instead? Well, I've already tested the Elder God arrow production before in this video, so with every possible boost active, I was able to produce around 2,500 full arrows in about an hour and 10 minutes as an estimate. Bichromia bolts, on the other hand, are kinda time gated by bloodwood tree runs, especially if all the trees go down very fast. But in just a few trees at a level 110 woodcutting and high level woodcutting equipment, I was actually able to get a fair amount of Bichromia bolts in just 20 minutes. It's really hard to say because it's very dependent on your woodcutting gear and levels, and then somehow you need to obtain Hydrix bolt tips, which are very expensive to buy. And after all that, you still need to enchant the bolts themselves. You could probably cheap out on using Ruby Bichromia bolts, but they won't perform as good as Hydrix Bichromia bolts. And this is just the ammo discussion alone. What about actual gear setups? Let's assume I'm on a relatively tight budget and don't even have Invention unlocked yet. For armor, both setups will simply use Ceramic armor. Since regular Ceramic actually has a set effect that benefits crossbows specifically, this does at least give crossbows a slight advantage here. For gloves, Ascension grips are a fairly cheap option if we're really trying to save some money. For boots, fleeting boots are still a solid early game option. For the purpose of this video, I'm just gonna use my enhanced fleeting boots since the difference is pretty minor anyway. As for the weapons themselves, bows actually have some very solid options. I could go with the tier 87 Decimation longbow, which is relatively affordable and comes with a very strong AoE special attack, although it's still fairly expensive for newer players, but you can augment it. A much cheaper alternative would simply be the Internal Magic Bow, MK5, which is a tier 90 bow that cannot be augmented and it has 7 range. Since invention perks are not part of this comparison anyway, the Internal Magic Bow MK5 becomes my choice here. For crossbows, the main two-handed option would be the Wyvern crossbow, but that thing is still pretty expensive. Instead, I'll use the Primal MK5 crossbows, which are tier 90 and extremely cheap to buy, although I was struggling trying to buy the offhand crossbow. Let's just say I bought the tier 85 version for very cheap, and then have a friend that could make one using internal magic logs. In my case, I had the levels to make it myself. For the pocket slot items, I won't bring one. For the necklace slot items, I'll stick with the Farsight Blunt necklace, which only costs around 1.7 mil and 100k Dungeoneering tokens to put together. For the ring, the 6H circuit, which is from Quest. And just like in my Fleeting Boots video, I also cannot use the regular Ricochet for this comparison, so I'm just gonna remove Greater Ricochet from my bar entirely and not use it at all. Piercing Shot would only be the proper substitute. I also don't want to change my quick prayers, so I'll just use Desolation, although Anguish is more realistic. For budget potions, extreme ranging potions are perfectly fine. However, because I personally have 120 range, let's just assume I'm around level 99 for this test and already have the stat boost active instead of constantly drinking potions. And with all that set up, I'm going to test which setup performs better at normal mode Kerapac. With bow build, I found without ricochet, being starved for adrenaline is very common. I ran into an issue where I don't get the dead shot right after using rapid fire at the beginning, which means I need to force a basic in order to do so. And then going into phase 3 using timer for imbue shadow was very slow with the bow build. With Crossbow Build, I actually found that issue was remedied by Hydrix Boats, but I still ended up facing Kerapac around the time of the first slam. And in phase 3, I actually had a lot more freedom to use Imbue Shadow and Time Warp into Swiftness quickly. I also had more freedom to spam more snapshots, but I do lose the 15% full damage effect. Despite this, the kill times weren't too far off, but actually Crossbow Build was a little bit faster than the bow build. I mean, if that wasn't the case, the ammo cost of Hydrix Boats would make that feeling worse. So what's the verdict? While Hydrix Crossbow builds could slightly outperform bow builds in the early game, is that small amount of faster kill speed really worth the ammo cost? If you want to save a bit of GP on ammo, I would suggest going with the bow build, especially since I also struggled purchasing the offhand primal crossbow. Otherwise, it does appear crossbows and bows can keep up with each other in the early game. Unless you're planning on doing some absurd stuff, I would suggest focusing on upgrading gear tied to bows. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you enjoyed, and bye bye.